we'll go with it and see what happens anyway. Thank you, Councillor Dovey. Please make sure all the phones are off anyway in the committee. We don't know for sure, but the live stream is going to be consistent then through this. We're starting as if it's all okay. So we'll do introductions first. I'm County Councillor Ruth Edwards and I chair the Planning Committee, and to my right...
Councillor Clark, and I'm the Vice Chairman.
Joanne Chase, Solicitor.
Philip Thomas, Development Services Manager.
Mark Hand, Head of Planning, Housing and Place Shaping.
Richard Williams, Democratic Services.
Right, thank you all very much indeed. Apologies for absence, please, Richard.
Yes, Chair. Apologies from Councillor Murphy.
Right, thank you very much. Declarations of interest. I know we do say as and when, but I would be very grateful if you could please make sure that they are forfeited towards the beginning of the meeting. Thank you. We'll go and confirm the accuracy of the previous meeting on page 1. Instead of going through all of them page by page, does anybody raise any concerns on any particular page, or do we move? Councillor Brown.
Yes, thank you. I just wondered if on the top of page 7, where it on the second bullet point, where it says other members consider that the application does not comply with policy DES1 and that the proposed development is not in keeping with the existing street scene. In particular, DES1 in brackets L had not been taken account of, because I did actually read out all of the DES1 points at the meeting, and it was the one that made the exception in DES1L. So I think it's important that that's put in as a matter of detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Brown. Is that noted then? Right, thank you very much. Anybody else got any more concerns about the accuracy of the minute of last meeting?
Prepared to move, Chairman.
Thank you. Do you have a second of it? Right. Proposed and seconded by Jim Higginson and Matt Feakin, seconded. Right, we now go on to the applications on 4.1 today. On 4 on the agenda.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Yeah. So this is the application at Well Lane for a building plot in the garden of the property Brookside. It's one that members visited back in December, and it was deferred in December to enable public speaking to take place. We'll just run through the slides here before I get into the detail. So that's looking at Well Lane, and the site is further up on the right. That's looking back towards properties on the other side of Well Lane. That's looking towards the access off Well Lane, and that is indeed the access as you go up to the parent property, up through the trees, and the parent property is further up the slope to the left. And that's looking, the access out onto Well Lane is in that area, so that's coming up the slope. And if the site is over down towards the left-hand side there, and if you carry on towards where where the picture further on to where the picture has been taken, that's where the parent property is and its driveway. And that's looking into the site, looking back towards other properties to the rear of the site. And that's the hedge at the front. And that shows it in context. That's where the plot would be in relation to Well Lane to its west, and the parent property Brookside to the north. That's shown where the existing access runs through the bottom left, as I'll call it, the southwestern part of the site, up through the grass and trees up towards the property Brookside. And then that shows where the plot would be in relation to Brookside. So it's an outline application. All matters are reserved, including access. And then the slide here, over here, part of the slide shows how the property would sit with a maximum scale parameter of 9 metres, minimum scale parameter height of 8 metres, so maximum 9, minimum 8, and a maximum footprint of 14 by 14 metres. With a minimum smaller than that, it's 8 by 8 metres. And that shows it in more detail, so I'll leave it on that particular slide. So Key issues here are, would the proposal fit into the village form without causing harm? How can it be, can the principle of it be acceptable in terms of it being drained, in terms of foul sewerage? Is it acceptable in all other respects? In terms of the principle of development, the site, Llanfair Discoed, is defined as a minor village in the local development plan. And within minor villages, they are considered acceptable for minor infill of up to 1 or 2 dwellings, resulting in the filling of a small gap between existing dwellings, subject to detailed planning circumstances. So in principle, a development on this particular plot is considered acceptable, subject to planning impacts. So in other words, it needs to fit in with the village form and character and surrounding landscape and other policies. And in this case, the garden area of Brookside is considered to be of sufficient size to comfortably accommodate an additional dwelling of the scale set out in this outline application and its associated amenity space, parking and services. The proposal constitutes infill development as the plot is surrounded on all sides by existing residential development. And the residential plots in this part of the village are especially large and characterised by open spaciousness, but this one would not erode that character as it fits comfortably within the plot without either being an overdevelopment of the plot itself or harming the residential amenity of adjoining properties because of the spaciousness retained around it. So in this instance, we feel that a development on this plot is acceptable in principle and would accord with the objectives of policy H3 of the LDP and policy DES1 category L, which Councillor Brown referred to when talking and discussing about the minutes in terms of not harming areas of particular privacy and spaciousness. Certain appeal decisions have been cited elsewhere in the village where plots were refused. The situation has moved on since they were refused in that the LDP was adopted, and prior to that, those proposals were considered under previous development plans of various guises. And in this instance, we also feel, if I can go back, that this site, if you look at the, sorry, let's go, that's probably a better one, sits within a logical infill plot. Some of the other proposals were on Courthouse Road, where plots were going to be, there was going to be development within the frontage of plots. It would look out of sync and out of kilter with that particular form of development in Courthouse Road, whereas this sits comfortably and neatly within the that sort of linear form of development that fronts onto Well Road and is appropriate in that respect. So we don't feel any appeal precedents should have a negative impact in terms of considering this proposal favourably. In terms of access, all matters are reserved. The proposal did suggest that there could be a new access for Brookside and a retention of the existing access for this particular proposal, but that's to be considered at reserved matters, as it is reserved in terms of means of access. There could be an independent access for Brookside, which may be acceptable. There could be a shared access indeed for the plot and Brookside, although I suspect there would need to be an independent access because otherwise the internal driveway would have to be altered to get up to Brookside, which could run right in front of the existing dwelling. So I suspect there will be 2 different accesses to the plots, but that's acceptable and highways are happy with that potential arrangement. In terms of residential amenity, there's sufficient space, as members saw on site, to protect local amenity. Windows and design would be considered at reserve matter stage, so precise first floor window design can be ironed out at that stage to prevent any direct overlooking of adjoining gardens or properties. But in itself, there is sufficient distance from the walls of the largest footprint of the building to adjoining plots to safeguard amenity, and presumably the property would front on towards, with principal windows towards Well Lane itself, which is protected by a decent hedge, and to the rear rather than to the side and to the south towards over the stream, which could be kept blank at first floor. So in terms of residential amenity, we feel that that's acceptable. In terms of foul drainage, this has been one of the more contentious aspects of the scheme. Llanfair Dysgoed hasn't got any mains drainage, so connection to the mains is not a viable option in this instance. There is Welsh Government advice in Circular 008/2018, which suggests that use of cesspits should be really discouraged, and that would be NRW's stance on this particular issue. And it would have to be demonstrated that was the only real option available if that particular type of drainage is going to be applied. Bearing in mind this is a minor village where infill is considered acceptable, provided they can demonstrate that a cesspool can be installed and managed effectively. When we don't feel that would be an impediment to approving this particular proposal. Building Control have come back, and you'll note in late correspondence they feel that there's sufficient extent within the plot to adequately provide the plot parking and accommodate a cesspit if that is what is necessary to drain the development at reserve matters stage. We would recommend that a condition is added if members are minded to approve it to ensure that foul drainage is actually considered at reserve matters stage, the detail of it, so that we can consult NRW and Building Control at that particular stage on the detail of the cesspool. But there's no substantive evidence to indicate the use of a cesspit and associated effluent disposal is likely to lead to a risk to public health in this particular instance. And we take note of Building Control's positive comments in relation to ability to accommodate a cesspool on the site if that is what would be used rather than a private treatment plant. I think that's about it. There is an affordable housing contribution to be paid if consent is granted, and that would come to 27,700 approximately towards affordable housing. I think that's it. I've gone through the main issues, and we would recommend approval subject to conditions. One issue that members may wish to consider is the scale of the dwelling. If they consider the height of it is a little bit too much, they can consider whether to reduce the maximum scale parameters, but that's a matter for debate by members who, particularly those who were at the site previously and know the site and its environs. But I would certainly recommend that a condition is added to ensure that foul drainage details are submitted as part of the reserve matters, so we can make sure that detail is acceptable, particularly given local residents' concerns. So we'd recommend approval subject to the Section 106 to secure affordable housing contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil. And most members are well aware Phil didn't need to read the whole report. We do have somebody who wishes to speak on this application, I believe. Please state your name, as I gather the actual applicant is not in the country at present anyway.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Martin Beattie. I'm the Community Councillor for Llanfair Dysgoed. Representing this afternoon Coem Community Council and local residents in the village, where we have received 26 formal objections to this proposal, 0 supporting comments from residents. The concern, twofold, on behalf of the Community Council. We are grateful for the excellent report that the planning officers have prepared, the 17-page report. However, there are 2 fundamental bases that we would challenge and disagree with within that report. And both are relevant to the summary that we have just heard. The first relates to highways, and within the report they have stated that the creation of an additional dwelling off Well Lane would not represent a shortfall in highway standards that would lead to real deterioration in highway security or capacity. We strongly disagree. This is a very narrow lane, bordered on one side by a 3 to 4 foot deep culvert with a watercourse running down it. It is a major feature of the village. If it were to be bridged by a new covered culvert, it would have to be of substantial width, splay, in order to avoid vehicles trespassing onto other property. Highways have indicated, in a conversation that I had with them, that they would not agree to such a new access. The problem therefore becomes that the existing shared access, the residents who share that access have already stated on the portal that under no circumstances will they agree to additional traffic relating to construction or a new dwelling across their shared access. There is therefore a major issue which would have to be addressed at reserved matters stage, which is sitting in the offing here, and which I think we're at risk of overlooking. We therefore disagree with the Highways feeling, and we also question what data supports that subjective view. Has there been a traffic and footfall survey? Does it take into account that there is a care home business at the top of the lane, which creates daily commercial and visitor traffic? And when was this last carried out? We challenge that subjective view. The second is from the perspective of the neighbouring property 9 Courthouse Road, which is directly neighbouring to the plot. This is stated to be 23 metres distant from the new building. Previously to today, I thought it was 12 metres high, but now apparently 9 metres high. My calculation is that the angle of sight from the building at 9 Courthouse Road, there for 47 years, will be 25 degrees of height. If you imagine looking up a hill of 25 degrees, that's overbearing. Now, the statement within the planning officer's summary is that there will be no overbearing impact. We, as a local council, community council, again strongly disagree. And it's on these bases that I, representing Caerwent Community Council this afternoon, request and recommend refusal. Thank you.
Thank you very much
Right.
indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you. You did very well on your timing, 4 minutes. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Right, as I said, most members have been to the site, so I'm open to comments now, please. Councillor Clark.
I'm a bit confused. On the opening page 15, Phil, you talk about a maximum height of 12 metres.
Yeah, that's a typo. It's in late correspondence.
Oh, well, I haven't got that.
Yeah, so it says, note to members, paragraph 1.1 of the officer report sets out the maximum height parameter for the proposed dwelling to be 12 metres. This was amended by the applicant
Okay.
later on, and it should read as 9 metres maximum.
Okay, but we could actually reduce that if we so thought.
If you're minded to.
Yeah, okay. And the other confusion is this. On the drawings, it shows the plan of the new proposed dwelling at 12 by 12 metres, yeah? If you double that with 2 floors, it becomes 3,100 square feet. You also go on to the report to say it could be 14 metres by 14 metres, and that is 3,700 square feet. You also say that the bottom parameter is 8 by 8, and that is only 1,500 square feet. We have a vast variance here between what we could permit and what we may permit, if you see what I mean. And the decision is before us this afternoon is A, if we give it permission, and B, at what scale we give it permission. I think the larger one at 14, nearly 4,000 square feet for a single property in a garden is far too large, and I think everybody needs to think on that one.
Chair, shall I just explain the concept of the parameters? In the arguably good old days, all applicants had to do was just draw a red line around a map and say, here's an outline application for something, for a house. Now the legislation requires that they give us maximum and minimum size parameters. So we've actually got more information than we used to have, but yeah, as Councillor Clark's alluded to, what we've been asked to consider is something between 8 metres by 8 metres and either 12 or 14.
It's 14.
It's 14,
Yeah.
14 metres by 14 metres. The very detailed aspects of where exactly on the plot it sits and how that impacts might, or how that setting and size of property might affect the neighbouring houses, that will come before us at reserve matters stage. So there is an element of unknown at this stage by nature of being an outline application, but we're confident the site can accommodate a large dwelling. The figures Councillor Clark's quoted, they are big, but the plot could take it theoretically. How it actually looks in design terms would be before us in the future.
Councillor Becker.
Just on that very quickly, because I'm in agreement really with Councillor Clark, that what are our options? Could we refuse on the basis that the parameters at their largest extent are too large?
Chair, my advice would be no, because we shouldn't refuse things if it can be overcome with conditions. So what you could do if you thought that higher parameter was too big, you could impose a condition to restrict the parameters, the maximum parameters. So you could overcome the reason for refusal with a condition, if that makes sense.
Thank you for the explanation, Mark. Councillor Harris, then Councillor Powell, then Councillor Giles Howard, and Councillor Brown. Did you put your...
Thank you, Madam Chair. As long-time members of the committee will know, I'm always rabbiting on about size of buildings on size of plots, and I gather we're going to have some sort of information about that coming soon. So I gather we've got a minimum and maximum size here. Can the officers tell me, for example, on the maximum size that we're talking about here, what percentage footprint that blob, if you like, of the building will take out of the total footprint, and similarly for the smaller one?
Sorry, I've only got the figure on the larger one.
Okay.
But that's the worst case scenario, I guess. So 14 by 14 metres would represent 17% of the area of the plot.
Well,
17.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, 17%, we're talking about some buildings with 50% of the plot, and we say, yes, 17% is perfectly acceptable as far as I'm concerned. And if I look at the plot next door to it, is it Well Cottage? I think the plot is as big or maybe a bit bigger than that one. We're talking about outline planning permission here, and for me to refuse an outline planning permission with all the parameters as stated by the officers as being acceptable because of the size of the building on the plot would be perverse. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Harris. Councillor Maureen Powell.
Thank you, Chairman. I was just going to make a comment about the worry they have over the traffic. If it was going to be 2 or 3 houses, it would make a big difference, but it is one house, and I assume one family, so it's not going to make a tremendous lot of extra traffic than if it was several properties. So I wouldn't think that was going to be a problem. It is a very large plot, and there may have been some concern over the height, but when you look at the picture near Phil there, and you compare the top of the pink house with the top of the original house, it's more or less level. But we haven't got the house next door to compare with as well. I don't know whether you know how much lower or whatever that is. It was just of interest. But as we've been told, that is putting in the largest that would be possible. And if we did condition it to be some bit smaller than that, I'm sure that possibly we could, we know if it was going to be allowed to be slightly smaller, that we could pass this.
Thank you, Councillor Powell. Right. Councillor Giles Howard, then Councillor Feakin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Maureen's asked my question, really. I was going to ask if there was a cross-section to show the relationship with the house to the south, because there is a reasonable fall on the ground southwards, which in theory you would think for the new dwelling to fit in, then it ought to be sitting a little bit lower than the existing house. I do feel that the height parameter is a little bit large, in that generally it's about 5 metres or so to the eaves, maximum height of 9 metres. Well, why would you need a house where the ridge extends, where there's a difference between 4 metres between the ridge and the eaves? I just think in that sense it's a little bit excessive, and like Councillor Clark, I'd be minded to suggest that could reasonably drop to 8 metres as well. I'm not so concerned about the footprint of the dwelling, because although the maximum is 14 by 14, it doesn't necessarily mean that the developer's going to build it to that extent, and indeed it could be wider than it is deep, so it could be only 8 metres deep and 40 metres wide and still provide a house that would be acceptable on the plot. The question I have for Phil is the highways one, and I was a little bit confused by the way the response to some highways have been presented in the report, but from what I see at the bottom, there are no objections, albeit it does state that a number of conditions are suggested. We've only got sight of the construction management plan, and what I would ask then, given that highways have made the point that there should be a single access serving the 2 points, is if that oughtn't to be subject to a condition as well, given that it's considered to be critical to the development and therefore qualifies as a condition that can be applied to a reserve matter, an outline application.
Thank you, Councillor Howard. Councillor Feakin? Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think I would prefer outline to actually specify their height, because I mean, I personally think 8 metres is high enough for a property, and again, I think it's been mentioned that it only covers a certain percentage area of the plot. Well, in some senses, again, we're using the wrong planning principles, as I pointed out in relation to DES 1. DES 1 is basically about a comparative density between neighbouring properties, not basically whether it's a big plot or not, or whether it fits or not. I mean, it's actually the point of DS1L, which says ensure that existing residential areas characterised by high standards of privacy and spaciousness are protected, etc. So I think we've got to be very careful when we're actually dealing with planning matters, that we actually apply the planning policy in the correct way and don't make statements that could be misleading in relation to this. But I would certainly prefer, rather than a maximum, a minimum, particularly on height. I don't know how it compares with the height of the others. I mean, we've seen that diagram. I mean, what height are is the other property? I mean, yeah, the one that is going in the plot of.
Yes, it's in there. So this is the property that's lower down.
Yeah. The host one, yeah.
The host one, that was shown in that cross section.
Was it about the same, was it, or not?
I think
slightly
it's...
higher, slightly higher. Yeah.
You got the paper plan?
Yeah.
The actual height from foundation to ridge is on this section. Shown on here is, just checking I'm reading this correctly, 6.482.
Can you read that? I can't read that.
That's what it's showing though, isn't it? Yeah, so it's just under 6.5 metres, the ridge height of the host property Brookside.
So it's too high then.
Yeah, shallow bridge.
So, Chair, in terms of the comments about the character of the area that Councillor Brown's raised, I popped Google Earth on there, We can go into Street View if you want to have a look at the surrounding property, or the one to the south of the site. But yeah, to the application sites in here, I think. So to the east, very big houses and very big plots. But then to the north, more modest-sized plots. Oh, I've just lost the overlay. Our technology is defeating us today. And also over here, there's 2 houses in these plots here. So there is a mix in the area. So I'd agree with the officer recommendation here. If you'll go into Street View, if you want to see what the other houses look like, for those of you who want a memory refresh from the site visit. I'll have to get my bearings now because it always drops you in a funny place. I think that's the application site in there.
That's right. So that was the lower property.
So this here is the lower property.
Yeah. So it is partially 2-storey, isn't it? That element of it's 2-storey, and then the rest of it's single. Single-storey, although it has got accommodation in the roof.
So that's what, 2.2. That's not going to be far off 7 metres, is it?
Councillor
I
Brown?
would have thought, yeah, it'd be a
Yeah, I think I prefer to see in view of what's been said, the height, a condition on the height actually lowering. The other thing that I wanted to mention is support Councillor Giles Howard in relation to the need for a highways condition, because obviously in the report itself, highways have mentioned that reserve matters should have an appropriate conditions, and there seems to be an informative, and that's about it. So I think you need a condition on that, and also you need a cesspit condition, I think, in relation to the cesspit itself, and also where the location of it is. As well on a map, and to have that as a condition, because I don't think the conditions on it are tight enough either. Thank you.
I believe some of that's going to come back as
Sorry,
reserved
can I just come back
matters.
on the couple of those points? Yeah, yes, I did indicate that we'd need to add a condition about foul drainage, so that would cover then the cesspit issue. Access is a reserved matter, so there's full control over where the point of access would go under the reserved matters. So I don't think that we actually need to actually have a separate highways condition. I'm not quite understanding why we would need that if we've got control at reserved matters stage.
Thank you, Phil. Councillor Feakin now, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just say I think we have made a bit of a rod for our own back in regards to the maximum minimum dimensions, because it used to be that you just have a red line would come before us and say we're going to build a house in that red line boundary, and we would all know and all accept that the dimensions of that dwelling within that red line boundary would come before us at a later stage or be delegated to officer. I'm confident that this will come back before us in an appropriate form, and if it's acceptable, it's acceptable. If it's not, it's not. I don't think we necessarily have to limit ourselves or limit the applicant at this stage regarding the dimensions, in so much as that it has to come back before us for a detailed plan and application in any event. If at the second stage, when it's before us, we decide that it is too big, too large, too high, too wide, we can then refuse it at that stage, or the officer has the delegated authority to do that. Bearing in mind all of the comments that have been made before us today, and all of the comments that have been made by the local residents, it's largely to do with issues which can be picked up in reserve matters. And with those thoughts in mind, I'd recommend approval, or I'd recommend the officers recommend, or I'd support the officer's recommendation for approval.
With all that in mind that has been stated before. Yes, yes. Councillor Howard?
Can I move an amendment that the maximum height is reduced to 8 metres? I'm concerned, and the thing is, I appreciate what Matt's saying, that we will see plans come back before us, but ultimately, if you give outline consent for something that can be up to a maximum height of 9 metres, then then you'd have to have a pretty good reason not to accept that at the reserve matters stage. And I just think you could, if you're not careful, end up with a dwelling that's got really quite a large mass, and a 9-metre high ridge would enable the creation of the third storey, albeit within dormers. And I'm not sure that would particularly sit well looking at the property next door, which is a mixture of 2-storey and 1.5. So I think it's entirely reasonable to drop the height max to 8 metres. But other than that, and the reason I suggested the highways condition was simply that any matters that are considered critical to determination at outline stage, and which highways have outlined in their response, can be put on as a condition. I'd be a little bit concerned then if at some future point a second access was created, and that might not necessarily need planning consent to do so, because there is a right of access to the highway. So I think it wouldn't be unreasonable to put the highways condition on as well, but happy to move it otherwise, subject to those amendments.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Howard. Mark?
Yeah, sorry, apologise for the phone. It wasn't mine, so I wasn't sure how to turn it off. In terms of Councillor Giles's amendment suggestion, the only thing I would mention is at the moment it's a minimum height parameter of 8 metres, maximum 9. So we'd need to change the minimum parameter as well. Otherwise, you're guaranteed to get a height of 8 metres because the minimum's 8 and the maximum's 8. So their only option is 8. So you'd want to reduce that as well.
Right. Councillor Brown, then Councillor Feakin.
Yeah, I think, from what's been said, just to clarify before any vote or anything is taken on this, we're actually talking about changes in 3 conditions, which is 1, the highways, 2, cesspit. And I still think you ought to include about location of it in the dwelling as well. I mean, I don't know whether any smells come from it. I'm just being ultra cautious there, and the third one on the height. So heights, cesspit, and highways. I think they need to be included in this outline stage. Thank you.
Chair, we might be talking across purposes. The condition that Phil's already mentioned about the foul drainage, that would include where the cesspit goes. Yeah. So that one would be covered. The height, Councillor Giles has proposed, I think, 7 metres minimum, 8 metres maximum. Excuse me. And then the highways, our advice is we wouldn't need a condition because it's a reserve matter, but we'll see what members want to do.
Thank you. So I think it's been moved, as Mark has just explained, by Councillor Feakin. Do you have a seconder, please? Councillor Roger Harris. Right, thank you. And that's all clear to everybody? Is that clear? That what you've suggested? So there's no more amendment to that, and this is just in outline. A minimum of 8 metres and a minimum of 7 and a maximum of 8. And the rest will be as reserve matters. Otherwise, we have Councillor Feakin has moved approval, and you have a seconder as Councillor Harris. Could I have a show of hands for approval for that, please? Right. Right. There's nobody against. Thank you very much indeed. We now go to Andy, and this is 01801 Elm Avenue. Is that you, Phil, as well? Thank
Okay, thank you. This is one we looked at this morning, so it's hot off the press. So it's a full application for the erection of a 2-storey detached dwelling in the rear/side garden of, it's a rear garden of 12 The Elms, or Elm Avenue. And just have a quick look at the photos to get our bearings. So that's the approach to the site on Elm Avenue. And that's the actual original property on the left, and then the site is where the garden is, and the garage is towards the top, and to the left of the hedge, which is coming out to accommodate the development. And there's a new dwelling to the right-hand side, which is not shown there, which we visited today. That's the garage, which is being removed to accommodate the new development. And those are, over to the left is one of two new properties that were approved 3 or 4 years ago on Tump Lane. And that's looking right at the end with the garage on the left and the pedestrian-only access onto Tump Lane, which is obviously access down towards the right-hand side. It's an unsurfaced lane, and this development would not access using Tump Lane. So there's the site in context, the red edge with the host property edged in blue, which would be with its part of its curtilage retained for number 12, and the new property, which we couldn't see on the earlier photo, is Carrig Goch over to the eastern side there. Then that's the existing layout, so it shows the garden and the garage up at the top, the hedge, and then the pair of semis, number 12 and number 11 down below it. And then that shows where the house is going in the property, in the garden there. So there'd be parking for the host property immediately to the side of the number 12, and then parking via a driveway and double garage for number 12. For the new dwelling alongside the new property there, with a garden in the region of 12 metres deep for the new property from the back wall of the house. The hedge to Tump Lane and at the rear of the plot would be retained. And that's the elevation detail of it. You can see it's set slightly higher than the proposed garage, set up roughly where the slab level of the garage is. I think that's, so what I'll do, I'll leave it on that particular slide. There'd be a 1.8 metre high close-boarded fence between the garage and the parking area and the rear gardens of the new property and number 12. So the footprint of the new dwelling, minus a garage, would be 9 by 9. It'd be 8 metres in height to its ridge, and the garage is approximately 6.5 metres square. And going back to what we were talking about earlier, the actual house and garage collectively would take up about 31% of the area of the plot. So in terms of the principle of development, the site is clearly within the built-up area of Undie, where residential development in principle is acceptable subject to detailed planning issues. The plot is considered to be of adequate size to accommodate a new dwelling, with associated parking provision and amenity space. The proposed dwelling, despite what residents' concerns suggest, we feel would be seen more in context with some of the properties in Tump Lane, and particularly the one opposite, rather than the semi-detached pairs that are on Elm Avenue itself. It's right at the top end of Elm Avenue, and it sits virtually adjacent to Tump Lane. So we feel that's the sort of character it's seeking to address, and that's a fair thing to do. The site would have vehicular access from Elm Avenue, and at present the existing property has access into a single garage, which we could see, and this would be removed, and parking provision for both the existing and the proposed dwelling would be provided alongside Elm Avenue, as shown earlier. There's no indication or intention for the metal barrier between Tump Lane and Elm Avenue to be altered or removed as part of the proposal. So the proposal would result in one additional dwelling being provided, and Elm Avenue is a reasonable cul-de-sac with sufficient capacity to accommodate the traffic resulting from one additional dwelling. The site plan submitted as part of the application indicates 3 off-street parking spaces will be provided for the existing dwelling, which is an improvement over the existing situation, and the 3 parking spaces plus a double garage would be provided for the new dwelling, which accords with our parking standards. A condition could be imposed requiring that the access is provided before work on the dwelling commences, and also a construction traffic management plan will be required that would be able to control the time and positioning of deliveries to the site. In terms of design, the dwelling would be finished in red-brown brickwork with artificial slates on the roof, and there would be sills and headers to all windows on the front and rear windows, rear elevations. And the new dwelling would be set at the front of the plot, very close to the road, This is acceptable as the proposed dwelling would be at the end of a no-through road, and thus there will not be disturbance from passing traffic. The private rear garden of the new dwelling would be a maximum of 12 metres in length and 15 metres in width, and the existing dwelling would retain a private rear garden with an average depth of 10 metres. The land slopes upwards in a northerly direction, so that the new dwelling would have a higher floor level than the existing dwelling, but given the distance between the two, this is considered acceptable in these circumstances. And the new dwelling will not be over-dominant as the existing dwellings to the as the existing dwellings to the northwest are also set at a higher level. In terms of water pressure that's been raised, this has not been indicated as an issue by Welsh Water. Indeed, this would be a matter for Welsh Water to resolve in any case, and it appears to be an existing problem. In terms of residential amenity, because of the orientation of the plot in relation to numbers 11 and 12 at an acute angle, we don't feel that it would have an unacceptable impact on the amenity of those properties. I think the key issue would be in terms of the impact on the amenity of Carreg Goch, which is on the other side of Elm Avenue. Members were there this morning and were able to have a look at that and assess the impact of the proposal, particularly its height, mass and first floor windows on the amenity of that property, including its patio windows on the side elevation, ground floor, and its garden area. Obviously, members can debate that in due course. There is a 1.8 metre high close boarded fence to screen the garden from the property, and there is approximately 15 metres between the proposed dwelling and the existing property at Carreg Goch. And given this distance, we feel on balance that this relationship is acceptable in these circumstances. I don't think there's anything else that I can add. Members will consider whether the impact on Carreg Goch is acceptable, having seen the site this morning. But we would recommend approval subject to a legal agreement requiring a contribution for affordable housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Councillor Brown?
Yes, Chairman. I don't know if people have...
Is there anything... We've got other speakers first.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a note of the fact that the local councillor had sent an email that she wanted read out. Thank you.
We know.
This is the email from...
Sorry, wait a minute. We'll have the other speakers first.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. I believe we have two speakers this afternoon. Councillor James Neepine and Richard Liddell. Oh, sorry. Do you wish to speak first as the objector? Yeah. You have 4 minutes to state your case, please. Thank you.
Are there any other photos that actually include pictures of our house? Because I didn't see any photos in any of that with our any sort of visual, like you couldn't see our house at all from any of those photos. It's not in that one. And there are... We'll have a look at it on Google Earth. I don't think it sort of gives a good representation of... Sorry to say that, but yeah. Also, there were some other photos of the side face of it that I've on the committee report that they've not been put up.
If you would like to carry on and
okay,
address
well,
the
yeah,
committee, and we'll try and get it. Thank you.
The proposed property will overlook, impose upon and negatively impact on at least 8 properties. Mrs Evans of 11 Elm Avenue feels the development is disproportionately larger, squeezed in and too close to her house. At the highest point of Elm Avenue, the visual impact will impose on her house and garden and mean she has no privacy and will ruin the sense of space and her ability to enjoy her garden. Mrs Evans is very upset and saddened that the proposal's being considered. Mr and Mrs Graham of 10 Elm Avenue also share these views and feel the building would be overbearing and negatively impose on their garden and take away their privacy and a sense of open space that it currently enjoys. They feel it will be extremely overdeveloped and are equally as devastated. We purchased Carrigog in July 2015 with my family, including my wife and 2 children. We looked at several properties in Maygate and Undy, but decided upon this one because it was not at all overlooked and provided us with the high standards of privacy. It has a west-facing garden, meaning we could enjoy sunny periods in our garden in the afternoons and in a quiet, peaceful lane with pleasant views of the landscape. We paid a price significantly higher than the other properties we looked at to give us this sense of privacy and space. We would never have bought the property if the proposed development was already in place when we looked at it. The main building I have measured will be a distance of approximately 30 metres window to window and will be parallel with the rear south facing of my property. I feel this is far too close. I am doubtful as to how realistic the proposed development's location is. According to the plans, there is a hedgerow growing through the northwest corner of the property. Our principally used area of garden is facing west and directly opposite the proposed development. We have one west-facing patio area and large double patio doors that open out onto the patio and is not a window as stated in the committee report. We use these doors on a daily basis, and during the summer these doors are left fully open during the daytime and we sit out on the patio to eat our evening dinner. The proposed building will be at an elevated position to our property and significantly higher than ours. We will find this overbearing. The building will take away the view of the landscape and the sunlight from the west and will cast a shadow over our patio and garden and block out daylight into our patio doors. The impact of this will be devastating for us. Due to its elevated position, all of the upper floor and ground floor windows and front door will look directly over the boundary fence and into our garden and through the patio doors and into our living room area. The 2 properties approved to be built at the Slades will already intrude upon our privacy. The development at Elm Avenue will mean we have no privacy in our garden or living room whatsoever. Policies DES 1 of the local development plan states the development proposals will be required to contribute towards sense of place, respect the existing form scale of neighbouring buildings, maintain reasonable levels of privacy and amenity of occupiers of neighbouring properties, respect built and natural views, and ensure that existing residential areas characterised by high standards of privacy and spaciousness are protected from overdevelopment. As objectors, we cannot see how the proposed development adheres to these principles. We believe that the application has not been assessed on its own merits. The development will directly negatively impact on more people than it will benefit and will affect the most important people in my life, my family. My 4-year-old daughter loves to play in the garden, especially in the sunshine. She has a playhouse there and a paddling pool. She even persuades my wife to adorn a swimming costume and join her in the pool on occasion. She likes to sit colouring on or playing in our living room. In these moments, she's happy. I do not want this feeling to be taken away from my daughter because she can no longer do these things privately. I would ask you to reject this proposal on the grounds that we will lose not just reasonable but all levels of privacy. I feel this will completely ruin our family home and take away everything that we love so much about it. It is not right or fair to take away our privacy and our enjoyment of our home and garden. Finally, I ask you, if you were the owner of my property or any of the other objectors' property, honestly, would you want this development to go ahead? That's it.
Thank you very much indeed. Please state your name and you'll have 4 minutes.
Sorry, thank you, Madam Chairman. Richard Liddell, I'm the agent for the applicant. A couple of things. First of all, can I point out that the position of the new house on the plan is directly opposite, as you can see on Google Earth there, directly opposite the area where the car parking is at the front. The garage is on the left, those 3 white blobs. So we're at the right of the top end of the site, not looking over the rear garden of Garreg Goch. Now, I obviously don't need to tell members of the committee that the whole essence of what we're trying to do in planning is to conform to policy. And if you have a planning policy that says that something is acceptable, then unless there are other material considerations, then obviously we are entitled to rely on the provisions of that policy. In this instance, we are in the middle of UNDI. The policy provision for providing an infill development is clear, so there has to be real and sufficient material considerations for any proposal not to proceed. Your officers have told you that it complies with all of these normal planning provisions. It's, excuse me, the plot is quite large. The plot that is left with the existing property is also quite large. The area that it's covered is 31% of the area of the plot, and it's been mentioned before that in some cases you've allowed consents where it's covered 50% of the plot. But you can see from the site plan that it fits naturally within the area that is the garden of number 12 at this moment in time. Privacy is achieved by distance. We've talked about the 12-metre garden boundary to number 11 Elm Avenue, the 15 metres to Garreg Goch, and of course the provision of the 1.8 metre fence and hedge, given that there are no first floor windows on that elevation of Garreg Goch, which looks over the site. So it is only that one window, I believe, on the right-hand side of the existing garage that you can see there. Privacy is therefore achieved by distance and by the fact that it's being on the ground floor. Parking has been mentioned. Your policies allow for 3 parking spaces, excluding a garage, for a new dwelling. And we also have to provide parking provision for the existing dwelling as well. So that does mean that parking provision will be improved considerably in Elm Avenue. I think everything has been covered so far as your officers are concerned. My conclusion would be that the proposal is planning is policy driven. The proposal complies with all planning policies, and there is a presumption in favour of granting permissions such as this, so long as it complies with all detailed planning considerations. And I would suggest to you that this is one of those properties that really does. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. As our local councillor can't be with us this afternoon. Right, Mark?
Sorry, I was going to say, do you want to show you the some of the Google Earth images as potentially as Councillor Powell's reading out Councillor Dimmock's email?
Could you read it out now, Councillor Powell?
Yes.
That's the local member's email that
Councillor Lisa Dimmock has sent this. Whilst I appreciate this is a desirable location and there is a demand for houses, I will have to object to this application on behalf of my constituents, because the development will have a negative impact on the amenity of surrounding homes by overshadowing, loss of daylight and loss of privacy, which will be incredibly distressing for our existing UNDI residents. The proposed dwelling is not in keeping with the stylistic context or scale of the Elms Avenue, which members would have seen on their visit. As raised by other residents, this is at the highest point of Elm Avenue, and the semi-detached properties surrounding this application will be overshadowed by this property that will stand at 8 metres. Whilst this house is in Elm Avenue, it will also impact residents on Tump Lane, especially Carrick House, greatly. I would welcome a more modest design to ensure those living in close proximity continue to enjoy their homes and, most importantly, retain their privacy. Points that I raised on the portal dated 6th of January 2019 that I would like to be taken into consideration. 1. I note that Welsh Water have made compulsory conditions I also believe the advisory note should be considered as compulsory requirements should permission be granted. The committee report dated the 8th of January 2019, uploaded on the 2nd of January, stated Mega and Undis Community Council decision was not received. However, it was uploaded to the portal on the 21st of December 2018. I would like to clarify if this misunderstanding has resulted in the Community Council's decision not being taken into consideration by the appointed planning officer for this application. If so, I ask that the committee now take the Community Council's letter into consideration when deliberating this application, as Community Council members are familiar with the location and highly knowledgeable of the impact the proposed dwelling will have on neighbouring houses. Whilst I appreciate housing is sought after in a desirable location such as this, nonetheless, if granted, it will be an exceptionally large dwelling on this particular plot that will incur a negative impact on neighbouring residents due to the scale of the build and the number of new builds and pending applications in the area. Thank you.
Thank you very much for reading that out on behalf of the local councillor. Quite a lot of the members of the committee were there this morning, and so I'd welcome your comments now, please. Councillor Alan Davis. Sorry, you obviously haven't got your microphone on.
I'm saying I think that this development will impact severely on the neighbours. And when we visited the gardens of those neighbours today, it was quite clear that that would be the case. I think the development is too large for the site. And I have complete sympathy with the neighbours and with the local councillor, and I couldn't possibly support this application on that basis. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, councillor. Councillor.
Yeah, I think I would second the refusal, I think on grounds of policy DES 1, because it doesn't fit in with the area it's in. I appreciate that the house opposite is, you know, also of a brick construction, but in terms of the height and size of it, it just isn't right for that particular area. It's a back garden development, and it isn't of the something of much more modest size would be appropriate there. And I don't think this, having been on the site, I don't think this is appropriate for this particular area. And you know, it does seem to be against, I think the original speakers spoke about DES 1, which I've been trying to get, but my laptop keeps cutting me out. But I think there's a policy EP1. I don't know if that's also relevant, but again, I haven't been able to scroll down because of the problems with this laptop at the moment. But obviously there's the grounds about privacy and so forth. And the front of the houses are sort of largely terraced properties with, you know, wide but fairly low roofs, as everybody saw on site. And I just think this is totally out of keeping with the character in the area. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Brown. Anybody else wish to comment? Councillor Anne Webb?
Yeah, I have a certain sympathy with the officers and the agent, because they are looking at our policies. We set these policies, and obviously there's a lot of work going on over this period of looking at this application to adhere to these policies. So I have a certain sympathy with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Webb.
I was going to come back on a couple of points, Chair, but do you want to go to Councillor Harris first?
Councillor Harris then first, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's another one with a building in a plot. Now, this is a very large building for this plot, and I've got every sympathy with the fact that I think it probably is too large. And if the general consensus is that it's the case, I can see where this is going. But I think I ought to mention, do we have options here? I think we do. We either refuse it if that's the way the meeting is going, or defer it, bearing in mind the agent has heard what we've been saying here. I want the best outcome for both the developer and the neighbours. So I wonder what the officers think is the best way forward.
Thank you, Councillor Harris. Mark, now please.
Yeah, thanks. That leads in quite nicely. Anyway, I think, Chair, as I mentioned, a few points have been raised, and there seem to be, from a couple of members, general support for those. I think I'd exercise some caution over some of those points. It hasn't come up particularly in members' discussion yet, but Parkham was raised by objectors. My advice would be this absolutely wouldn't be a reason for refusal. It's actually a betterment because the current property has just the little garage at the top of the garden. So this would provide all the off-street parking needed for the current property, plus over and above what the policy requires, the 3 spaces for the new dwelling. In terms of the style of the property and the character of the area, again, I'd urge you to exercise some caution over that approach as well. I don't know if it's worth plugging in Google Earth again, but those of you there this morning will see there is a big mix of properties. Elm Avenue itself, to the front of the site, is predominantly the terrace of semi-detached a street scene of semi-detached properties. Terrace of semi-detached properties. But on the opposite side of the street are different age detached properties, different sized plots. To the north on Tomb Lane is again a mix, some probably Victorian or older terrace properties and a mix of detached. So I don't think the fact that it's detached and slightly different looking to the Elm Avenue homes is in itself an issue or something we could substantiate at appeal. I think the 2 key points that came out from the site visits and other parts of the conversation earlier were about the overlooking potential and maybe overbearing impact on the neighbouring property. There has been mention of overshadowing, but given it's to the north of the existing properties and the gardens are reasonably sized, I can't see it having an overshadowing impact on the neighbours. So I think the key points for members to look at will be overbearing and overlooking. If I just get the plug from Phil, I'll plug in Google Earth again, so you can review some of the points being made. I did say I'd try street scenes so you could view the existing property, but I think as the neighbour was trying to tell me, his home doesn't show up on street scene, just on the aerial photo.
While you're doing that, Phil, Councillor Feakin.
Thank you, Chair. And just in line with what Mark is saying, really, it seems to be to do with scale. The last property we looked at in the last application was 17% of the plot size was going towards a house. This one looks more, probably 65% possibly. 31, is it? Okay, it looks different on the plan that's before us. But it must be to do with scale. It's to do with scale, and it's to do with the overbearingness within the plot. So I'd like to investigate further what Roger suggested, in as much as is there a way to defer it possibly and bring back a reduced scale, which might be more appropriate. That's only to ask the question back to Mark again.
Okay.
Thank you.
Chair, just briefly on Google then. So we got the semi-detached properties on Elm Avenue, very similar along this stretch, but more kind of 1970s-ish at a guess down here. And then these various other detached properties in the area, some of which are located off Tomb Lane, some of which are located off Elm Avenue. But in terms of that character, I think we'd struggle with that argument personally. This probably gives you a fairly good idea in terms of overshadowing. This was taken, it's normally a date at the bottom. I'm not sure when it was taken, I can't see the date on there. But not terribly long ago. I don't think this property's finished, which is relatively new. The gentleman next door was talking about his patio and the patio doors, and the agent was talking about the parking area. So you can see quite clearly on the slides, there's the fence, got the parking area to the north, the patio is in here, and those patio doors are in that side elevation, which serves the living room in the back of the house. But you can clearly see it's a sunny part of the garden as well. So the dwelling would be in this location. It is bigger than the footprint of this garage.
Thank you, Mark. I think it's Giles. Is it?
Oh, okay, thanks. Well, the first question is, can you confirm what the distance is between the principal elevation of the new house and the patio doors and the side of, I can't remember the name of the property, so you get an idea?
There's a Carreg-Goch, yeah. There's a bit of dispute about this. The report suggests it's 15 metres. I mean, I haven't measured it. And the gentleman who lives in the house suggests it's more like 13 metres. So it's something between 13 and 15 metres, I would suggest.
Right. I know generally as a rule of thumb you might allow maybe 11 to 13 metres between posting elevations where you've got a principal elevation onto a side, but given that there is a window to a habitable room there, my judgment is that views from the first floor would be perceived as being intrusive through that patio door, and the relationship there I don't think is satisfactory. Maybe that could be dealt with by a redesign or amendment, or maybe to arrange first floor accommodation so that there weren't any windows directly overlooking. But I think the key for me is one, it's more about layout than anything else, because there's absolutely nothing wrong with the design of the house. It's fine, it's one I'd be happy to live in, but there's little mention of the impact on the street scene and how it contributes to, or otherwise, to the sense of place. And it's because of the nature of the plot and the limitations on how it could be laid out to enable access and parking and not be detrimental to the amenity of the properties further to the southeast, then the layout has been determined by the constraints of the plot, and I don't feel that and pushing the house right to the front of the highway produces a very acceptable relationship in terms of how other dwellings are laid out and spaced on, arranged on plots. I think it would appear, because of the proximity to the highway, relationship with other dwellings. I mean, if you had a blank piece of paper, you wouldn't design a new house to be, how can I put it, have to have that relationship with neighbouring properties. And I think the layout for me then, and the impact of its position on the plot, I think is detrimental to the street scene. And I also think that because of the limited distance between that and the patio doors of the house, on the opposite side, I think that would be detrimental to the amenity of the residents on the other side of the road. So I'd be happy to go with the views of members who visited the site as well.
Thank you. Councillor Feake and then Councillor Brown. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And Phil, just to pick up on that one point again then about, and picking up as well on what Giles just said, it's largely about mass, probably, within the street scene, possibly. But you said it's 33%. Could I suggest, could we just go 30, sorry? 31. Could we just go back to that one? That's it. Could I suggest that 31% is only the residential house itself, the actual dwelling? It doesn't include the garage or the parking or anything else? It does include the garage. To me, it looks more like 50% at least. To me, I don't know whether it's a drawing that's wrong. No. Okay. Yeah. Not only on that probably explains a lot on scale. On scale, it looks like that house and garage is taking up a lot more than 31%. And maybe that in itself is a demonstration of what the mass would look like in the street scene. And I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. And it is rather a large garage when you look at the footprint of the garage to the one of the house. Councillor Brown.
Yeah, I think possibly in relation to DES1, it is correct in saying that it's the mass and scale that is the issue, but also I think the height as well, because of the fact that the property opposite, for example, is a lower height, which makes, although 8 metres sounds quite reasonable, when you were on site, because of the lay of the land, it actually means that it does overbear, even though on paper you'd look at it, and if you hadn't been on the site visit, you'd think, well, you know, that sounds quite reasonable, but on the site visit you could see that it would be you know, way above the telegraph poles, etc. So I think the DES one is correct, but obviously it's in relation to the emphasis on that particular policy, and you know, obviously officers can, depending on what the committee decides, can determine which appropriate parts to emphasise of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Brown. Yes, I thought it was in a very elevated position, that whether they could lower it where the garage, if that is obviously going to be removed. The garage on the drawing is very large, almost enough, when you look at the footprint of the actual house, you could still have another house next door in one day. I'd like to see a garage in perpetuity. But anyway, when you look at the actual garaging and the house and the car parking, there's about 50% of garden left. Is that about it?
Well, not according.
I think the common consensus at the moment is it's rather large on the plot. Giles Howard again, please, quick.
Thanks, Chair. Just very quickly, I forgot to mention, because I was having trouble engaging my mouth and brains together at the same time. I've obviously missed a conversation on the planning bus about the relationship of footprint to plot, but that 31% is meaningless unless you reference it against the surrounding development. So, you know, if the other houses has a relationship of 20% or 70%, if it was a really urban area, then it would be meaningful. But as it stands, you know, 31% is nothing, and it's all about the context of the site.
Thank you. Right, I think we've given it a fair airing this afternoon. Yes. Does anybody wish to move one way or the other? Councillor Feakin.
I'd like to, for me, if it's possible, I'd prefer to see it deferred, in as much as that it does suit some a large raft of policies, but it seems largely to do with scale and mass and design. Therefore, for me, I'd prefer to see it deferred and give the applicant a chance to bring it back before us to amend it, rather than straight refuse it. But that's only my recommendation, my suggestion.
Right. Thank you. I personally agree with that, but I mean, I'm open now to the committee. Do you have a second? Councillor Harris is going to second that.
Sorry, could I just clarify in terms of actual procedure of this committee? Because I was under the impression that Councillor Davies had already recommended refusal and I'd seconded it. So, you know, and now you're asking for a recommendation.
I'm sorry, I did not take that on board. And I did not
That's correct, isn't it, Councillor Davies?
No,
Thank you for that clarity, Councillor Davis. So it's been moved and seconded for deferral. Could I have a show of hands for deferral, please, for an amended plan? Right, thank you.
Chair, in the interest of clarity, could I just make sure we grasped what we're asking the applicant to look at? So we talked about, I think, overbearing and overlooking of the house opposite on the other side of the lane, and the scale of it. Members feel it's too big. Okay.
Mark, can I just
Councillor
say
Davis.
that the lady in the terrace block as well, she was saying about being overlooked through her windows, and I think that is a valid point as well, looking at the development. Okay.
Councillor Brown?
Yeah, and could we also mention the height, because of the fact that the, you know, properties, the sloping of the land. Thank you.
Thank you. But could the committee please stay seated a moment, please, as Richard will shut off the live streaming. So, yes, so if all the public could please leave the